Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Han-dan in Seoul. 74 years have passed since North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, igniting one of East Asia's deadliest conflicts. The 3-year Korean War exacted a devastating toll, with estimates of millions of civilian and military casualties. Yet, despite the painful memories and over 7 decades of bitter division, the two Koreas remain technically at war, with recent months witnessing a troubling escalation in inter-Korean tensions. On top of the mounting hostilities, the world is now trying to piece together what the new military pact signed between the leaders of North Korea and Russia could mean for the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. Korean War, 74 years on, where do the two Koreas stand? That's the topic of our discussion today, and joining me in the studio is our regular commentator, Dr. Myong-hyun. It's always a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
For another voice in the conversation, we also have Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, head of the Japan and Korea's program at the University of Cambridge's Center for Geopolitics. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
All right, Dr. John Nilsson-Wright, let's start with you. It marks the 74th anniversary of the start of the Korean War, but the two Koreas are still at war and inter-Korean tensions are reaching new highs. First, give us your assessment of the current security situation surrounding the two Koreas.
Well, it's pretty delicately balanced, isn't it? I mean, we've seen, of course, materially over the last few months, a steady increase in North Korea's military capabilities. I mean, that's been building, of course, all of those nuclear tests that go back to 2006 and have continued steadily over a number of years. New effective military doctrine on the part of North Korea. We've seen in the last year, of course, Kim Jong-un talking about the willingness of North Korea to use its nuclear assets in the event that it feels threatened by South Korea. And of course, this new agreement, this new joint strategic partnership between Russia and North Korea. The worry is that this will embolden Kim Jong-un, a man who has already demonstrated that he is, by comparison with his father and grandfather before him, perhaps more of a risk taker. Another big signature development, of course, some time ago was the decision by the North to abandon the long-standing position of supporting in principle the idea of unification between North and South Korea. And so it's for all of those reasons, diplomatic changes, security capacity, new norms, and perhaps the character of the North Korean leader, that the world is increasingly worried about the security situation on the peninsula. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that President Yoon, the South Korean president, in his statements commemorating the anniversary of the start of the Korean War, characterized the provocations from the North as, in his words, vile and irrational. That's pretty strong rhetoric. And the worry, I suppose, is how will North Korea respond to that rhetoric? We know, of course, that there have been efforts to bolster North Korea's military defenses on land at the DMZ. And all of this, I think, is adding up to a general picture in which the risk of conflict through this heightened tension, and of course, perhaps most importantly of all, the risk of conflict through misperception and miscalculation is a very real and present danger.
I think that pretty much very nicely sums up the current situation. After all these years, what we're seeing now is stronger than ever North Korea-Russia defense cooperation, boiling tensions near the border, and hundreds of trash-filled balloons as well. We have a bleak future ahead of us. Dr. Go, security dynamics, it seems, have entered a new phase after North Korea and Russia signed the new military pact that includes a mutual defense clause in the event of an aggression. Does this cross South Korea's red line?
No, I think the South Korean side drew a new red line after the signing of this mutual defense pact between Pyongyang and Moscow. And the National Security Advisor Jang Oh-jin, in his press conference after the summit between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, he said that the South Korea will be watching very carefully whether Russia would transfer high precision guided weapon system to North Korea. And he also added in another instance that there will be no more lines for South Korea to hold back now that the two sides have signed this pact. So there's a little bit of vagueness to this. But then this is only, I mean, it's understandable and at the same time makes sense because you don't want to specify exactly what red line you have because you want to send, keeps this kind of red lines vague so that the other side doesn't use the red line against you. For instance, by drawing a red line of signing the Mutual Defense Pact, then the other side, in this case Russia, could come up with an agreement that in fact it amounts to a mutual defense pact, but that they concur in a different name, which is exactly what happened. So I think the South Korean side is drawing a new red line, but it's keeping it vague to make sure that Russia doesn't use it against South Korea. But then the circumstantially speaking, the remarks from the South Korean government seems to indicate that if Russia transferred precision-guided weapons to North Korea, which could also include jet fighters and so forth, or then anti-air missile systems, then South Korea would, National Security Advisor Chang Ho-jin stated very clearly that could transfer weapon systems to Ukraine. Because Russia is clearly on the defense, I mean, sometimes on the defense, sometimes on the offensive, but it looks like a Russian offensive right now is petering out. So if South Korea supplied the weapon systems to Ukraine at this juncture, that could potentially turn the tide of war against Russia. So I think South Korea is clearly pushing the button the right way to influence Russian action from now on and deter Russia from getting too cozy with North Korea, for instance, upgrading their military cooperation.
So it's pushing the button in the right way, but it's keeping its red lines rather ambiguous strategically. The South Korean government actually has been sending Russia warnings not to sign such a military pact, but even before the Kim-Putin summit, but Russia went ahead and signed it anyway. And now it says that Seoul shouldn't worry about it if Seoul doesn't plan on any aggression against Pyongyang. So we'll discuss more about South Korea's possible response to this. But before that, Dr. Nilsson Wright, South Korean intelligence is closely monitoring the possibility of North Korea sending troops to Ukraine. In your view, what are the chances of that actually happening?
That seems, I would say, fairly far-fetched at this stage. First of all, I mean, consider the nature of the defense agreement or the security partnership. It is Article 4 of the document, the 23-point statement, effectively that outlines what security partnership might look like, specifies that Russia and North Korea will come to one another's assistance in the event that they are attacked. It seems unlikely that North Korea, given all of its own security concerns on the peninsula, would want to deplete its military personnel, its assets, which of course are very vital in protecting its own interests. And of course, what North Korea really wants from Russia are all the things that Professor Go was outlining. It's the possibility of technical assistance to enhance its satellite and missile technology regime. And of course, money, oil, resources, which North Korea, of course, is critically short of. And it would be such a major escalation. The concept of seeing North Korean forces fighting on the European continent is unprecedented. So I think that's extremely unlikely. But of course, it's very important for the South Korean government to keep a very close tab on what North Korea is doing materially. A more likely prospect, which has been discussed, is the idea that North Korea might be able to provide labor to assist in infrastructure construction, potentially in the Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. And that, of course, is something that the Russians would welcome, not only because of its material benefits, but because of the symbolic significance of strengthening this partnership, sometimes referred to as part of the axis of authoritarian regimes. Putin, of course, wants to create as much mischief as possible through this bilateral agreement. And all of these things, all of these events, facts on the ground, if you like, sending missile technology, sending armaments, sending munitions that North Korea has already done, would of course be reinforced by the decision to send men and personnel to assist in those construction efforts.
So North Korea sending actual troops to Ukraine seems a bit far-fetched for now, but as you highlighted, some experts say that Russia may attempt to use North Korean troops to more efficiently control and perhaps reconstruct the territories it declared as its own, such as Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. But we're yet to see solid signs of that actually happening. So it's another point that the world will closely monitor. Now, Dr. Go, concerns are also rising that North Korea-Russia military treaty may help both countries, both North Korea and Russia, circumvent global sanctions. We want to hear your thoughts on this.
I think that's very clear. One of the concrete outcomes of the summit has been exactly Russia essentially declaring that he is not going to abide by the international sanctions regime, particularly the United Nations sanctions resolutions against North Korea, because Russia considers those sanctions measures essentially illegal from their point of view. It has lost legitimacy, and it's claiming that it's in fact a biased or partiality, reflects the partiality of the United States that essentially is set against countries like Russia and North Korea. The irony here is, of course, that Russia, being one of the permanent members of the Security Council, and had completely agreed to passing these resolutions against North Korea. But now that Russia is on the receiving end of the sanctions, he has changed his mind and is coming out with all different types of rationalizations. But then that is clearly pointing out the moral flaws in the Russian argument doesn't really make sense anymore. What matters is really the actions that Russia is going to take from now on. So clearly Russia is not going to abide by the sanctions. But the truth is Russia wasn't abiding by the sanctions to the full extent that the international community expected before. So there are widespread eyewitness accounts of North Korean workers present in Russia after the sanctions against North Korean overseas workers passed in 2017. The difference is that Russia doesn't really care about the optics anymore. So we see more blatant, more official policies of using North Korean labor, perhaps not on the front lines of Ukraine, but elsewhere in Russia, now that Russia is facing labor shortages due to their conscription to send soldiers to Ukraine. So we see clearly a more higher presence, like a widespread presence of North Korean workers in Russia. We would also expect Russia supplying forbidden items to North Korea. I'm not talking about weapon system here. It's going to happen. It's happening already. But then we're talking about refined petroleum and other types of commodities and machines, dual-use machines that are non-weapon systems that will be supplied to North Korea directly, probably. So essentially, in the total sum of things, it's not going to go fundamental difference to North Korea. But then everything will be conducted in the plain sight, thereby really undermining the sense that the international community is united against North Korea's illicit WMD programs.
Well, first, the termination of the UN panel that has been closely monitoring North Korea's sanctions for more than a decade, and now a new military pact with many loopholes that could lead to sanctions evasions. Like you mentioned, Russia may not have been 100% restricted by those sanctions even before this new treaty was signed, but still it looks like North Korea and Russia are getting bolder and more blatant with their tactics. And staying with you, the North Korean Workers' Party is expected to hold a big plenary meeting soon to conclude the first half of this year. Do you expect some kind of a follow-up measure to the new military pact to be announced, or what kind of message do you expect from Kim Jong-un?
Well, legalistically speaking, North Korea, quote unquote, has to ratify this agreement. I mean, this treaty, and North Korea's political structure requires the Supreme People's Assembly to ratify this treaty. But obviously we know that in North Korea, those kind of mechanisms are symbolic only. What really matters is Kim Jong-un's own words and thoughts. So yes, it's going to be a rubber stamping of the treaty, but nonetheless, this is a formal step that North Korea has to take. And also there are follow-up measures that the North Korean government has to take, essentially execute. For instance, the agreement dictates that the two countries will have to assist mutually in case of security threats. the party that's under security threats right now, quote unquote, will be Russia, because Russia is engaged in conflict against Ukraine. So chances North Korea is going to make formal announcements to take follow-up measures to assist Russia militarily. And we don't know what kind of measures that will be. I think that's going to, again, amount to another way of North Korea raising tensions in the Korean Peninsula, especially if North Korea is going to send formally soldiers, troops to the Ukrainian front. But then as Professor Nielsen Wright has pointed out, that's probably unlikely at this juncture. But then, for instance, North Korea could send workers instead, and I think that's probably more palatable to the Russian government at this point. But then there could be other measures, like such as provisions in the North Korean constitution that states clearly that North Korea is going to help its ally. I don't think it's going to name Russia, but only by all indication will be Russia in this case, essentially stating in writing in the constitution that it's going to help Russia in case of a contingency. So there are all these different provisions, actions that the North Korean regime could take, but all these measures amount to essentially a political offensive on the part of North Korea that on Assam is going to have the effect of saying that North Korea, as an equal peer country to Russia, have signed a treaty of mutual assistance, and therefore, in a way, North Korea aspired to achieve prestige through these kind of measures.
So a Supreme People's Assembly will likely follow the plenary meeting, and it's widely expected to include a constitutional revision as well. So it's another key point to watch out for. Dr. Nielsen Wright, South Korea, the U.S. and Japan will conduct their first multi-domain military exercise dubbed the Freedom Edge this week, involving the U.S. Navy's nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt. It'll mark the first Trilateral drill to be held after the rare Kim-Putin summit. How do you anticipate North Korea and Russia to react?
Well, the North Koreans, of course, have already, in their rhetorical response, been very clear. There's been talk of increasing their deterrence capacity, overwhelming and fresh deterrence measures, I think was the language that the North Koreans were using. The Vice Minister of Defense has been scathing and criticizing the deployment of USS Theodore Roosevelt to the region and to South Korea. It does raise an interesting question. What would this look like? I mean, there are, of course, a number of options. We might see, for example, the North Korean government deciding that it wants to test its missiles. We might see strengthened maneuvers on the part of the North Koreans in some context, either at land or at sea. In all of this, of course, however, I think it is a sort of delicate situation where there's not a great deal that North Korea can do substantially that will really push back against these new, fairly unprecedented trilateral exercises between the US, ROK, and Japan. And the reason they're happening is precisely to signal to North Korea that it needs to limit its provocations. You mentioned the Supreme People's Assembly. It may well be that coming out of that meeting, we will have a very clear statement from the North Korean government that identifies South Korea as its primary opponent. And that would be symbolically and practically also, I think, an important step forward. There's one other area which, of course, I think is perhaps worth thinking about given past precedent, which is the ambiguous division between the two Koreas in the West Sea, the so-called Northern Limit Line, which defines the maritime boundary between the two countries, has always been contested. And it may be the case that the North Korean government decides to make a more definitive statement about how it sees that contested territory. And of course, your viewers will probably need no reminding that back in 2010, we saw the shelling of Yongpyong Island, an incident which created real security instability on the peninsula. Could we see something comparable to that? It's very hard to say, but the North Koreans will, I think, be thinking of how to demonstrate that they need to be taken seriously in the wake of these new trilateral exercises.
And the final point of our discussion today is also for you. The North Korea-Russia Defense Treaty has reignited debate over the nuclearization of South Korea. What's your take on this? And in your view, is the new military treaty threatening enough to change the framework of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Well, there's no mistaking the anxiety in South Korea about the vulnerability of the country. And of course, it's precisely because of that that the United States has reached out to South Korea to put in place new mechanisms precisely to guard against the danger that South Korea might be minded to push for its own independent nuclear capabilities. We saw that with the decision to establish the Nuclear Consultative Group. And just recently, on Monday of this week, we saw Kurt Campbell, the Deputy Secretary of State, saying very clearly that it's important to strengthen that mechanism in order to avoid precisely that outcome. However, of course, public opinion in South Korea, over 70%, supports the idea of a potential independent nuclear capability for South Korea. And we've just seen the release of an important report by one of the leading think tanks in South Korea, INSS, which has broached the different permutations of a potential more enhanced nuclear capability that might involve nuclear sharing using the NATO model, potentially the redeployment of US tactical nuclear assets to the Korean Peninsula, and then the even more potentially challenging change, which would be the development of an independent South Korean nuclear deterrent. I think we're some way off from that position, but it's a reminder, I think, of just how uncertain the situation. And of course, looking ahead to November and the presidential contest, if Donald Trump were to win, that raises yet more anxiety about the risk of American abandonment, further fueling that appetite on the part of some South Koreans to push for that independent nuclear capability.
Well, Washington has been drawing a clear line, saying that the Washington Declaration itself and extended U.S. deterrence is enough to deter North Korea's nuclear threats. But calls are growing, especially among the conservatives here in Korea, that it's time for South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons, or at least start to seek potential nuclear capabilities. Well, it's an issue that will certainly keep popping up as North Korea, Russia deepen their military cooperation. But we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Nilsson-Wright, for your brilliant analysis.
My pleasure.
And many thanks to you as well, Dr. Go, as always, for your insights.
Always my pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.